Welcome to Detoxicity. By men, about men, for everyone. This is a podcast that's attempting to remix the narrative around masculinity, and I thank you for listening and supporting. If you're new to the podcast, I hope you check out the archive, which contains over 150 episodes. I'm always happy when someone reaches out with a friendly word or constructive criticism, so never hesitate to hit me up either via IG at DetoxPodGuy or via email, detoxpod@gmail.com. You can also contact me if you're interested in being a guest on the show or if you know someone who might be a good guest for the show. There's also a Detoxicity Patreon. Patrons get episodes 1 week early, plus I will mail you a cool DetoxPod fridge magnet. Go to bit.ly/DetoxPodPlus to find out more. Oh, one more thing. Late last year, I completed my certification courses, and I am now a life and relationship coach. I'm taking clients. Go to mike-joseph.com and book a free consultation. Thanks for listening. I really do appreciate you. Hey everybody, I am very happy to bring you this new episode of Detoxicity with my guest Rodney McCoy. Rodney McCoy, or Daddy Rod, is an activist particularly for sexual health and HIV. If that sounds like a through line from our last episode with Damon Jacobs, there is an additional through line. Rodney is Damon's partner, and thank you, Damon, for recommending Rodney to me. We had a fantastic conversation. In addition to his activism work, which has been going on for over 40 years, Rodney is a born and bred New Yorker. I love talking to other people who were born and raised in New York because it seems like we're unicorns nowadays. So we talk about his upbringing, the things that he went through growing up, and we have a lot of interesting sort of sub discussions about things like consent and what that means in the queer community versus what that means amongst more straight identified people. We talk about obviously the podcast as a whole is about masculinity, but we talk about some specifics regarding masculinity and how that can also differ from individual to individual, how people like to be referred, all that sort of stuff. And of course, we talk about his activism in today's climate and how that sort of scales to 2025 levels versus when he started in actually a very similar environment in the 1980s. Anyway, this is a great conversation, first of hopefully more than one, and I'm very happy to introduce you to Rodney McCoy, or Daddy Rod. So, tell us a little bit about you.
Wow. Well, the first thing about me is that is one question that I absolutely not quite hate, but it's one that I really don't like because in my mind, it's like, well, where should I start? What can I talk about? I am 57. I'll be 58 this year. So
Congratulations.
thank you. And so, again, a life lived that is still being lived. I'm always mentally a deer in headlights when someone's asking me, tell me about yourself. So that's a little bit about me. I probably panic at that one. So what's helpful for me is if there's something in particular you'd like to know about me as a place to start.
I guess, and this might not be as specific as you want it to be.
That's fine.
What enticed you or what drew you, besides the obvious person we have in common, to take part in this conversation?
I think I'm going to start there because for those who are viewing this who don't know the person we have in common, Damon Jacobs, the host and creator and host of Tub Talks, because that's actually where I literally saw you and him in the tub. And so after asking a few questions, like mostly curious, I was like, so who's this hot man in the tub with you? Tell me about him. That is literally what I said. And so from there, he told me about your podcast and he recommended me as a potential guest. So I said, okay, you know what? I like the topic, detoxifying masculinity, because, and maybe this might help in terms of our discussion. I do identify as a masculine cisgender man. And I think particularly as a Black man, there's a standard of masculinity that I do not subscribe to, but at the same time doesn't make me any less masculine. But that's how I define myself. And again, for folks who didn't quite put two and two together, Damon is my partner. So I say that as a gay/queer man, as a Black man, as a man living with, well, not living with HIV. HIV is living with me. I was here first. So
that's right.
Exactly. So with all those things, and we can probably touch on being an older man, being a man who is active in the leather and kink communities, a man who has been doing work around HIV and STI prevention, education, and care for this year makes it 40 years. This year September will make it 40 years. So there is a lot. And also I have a podcast, Listen to Daddy, which I'd be happy to talk with you about. So I have a vested interest in talking about detoxifying masculinity, making masculinity a good word again. You're like, fuck, I don't know how explicit we can get.
Say whatever you want.
Fuck MAGA. Fuck that Make America Great Again alleged bullshit. Let's make masculinity great again in true terms, in terms of really looking at some things, because I like identifying as masculine. I like doing masculine things, hanging out with my guys, watching football. Yes, Damon is a football widower, as it were, although he will be the first to say I actually got him into appreciating the sports. So he's not quite a football widower. But all of this to say, I mean, I like playing sports. I work out. I do some traditional masculine things. And I understand people's gut reaction against it because of what it represents for so many people, including other cisgender masculine men. But those are some of the things that I like to embrace. And especially as a Black gay queer man with HIV, I want to challenge people's notions around who embraces it, who enjoys it, and how do we rethink what masculinity is. So see what one simple question got.
Opens up. Actually, what it really does is it opens up like 55 other questions.
And I'm okay with that.
In my brain. And I want to start from the beginning.
Okay.
So where did you grow up?
Brooklyn. I'm a New York City native.
You know, Rodney, there are so few these days born and raised people in New York. I'm also born and raised in Brooklyn. And when I tell people that I've lived here, I haven't lived here my whole life, but I was born and raised here.
Right.
People are like, oh, you're a local? Like, there are no locals. It's such a strange thing that there are so few locals in New York City anymore.
And the thing is, I'm not local anymore. I'm in D.C. So now I fit that trope of the transient Washingtonian. In fact, there are some folks who are like, well, you've been here 20 plus years. You're practically from here. I'm like, no, I'm not.
Once you're from Brooklyn, you are always from Brooklyn. That does not go away.
Exactly. I have an ex who once said to me, why do you New Yorkers leave New York just to talk about how great New York is? I'm like, built-in tourism, baby. So, built in.
Built in. And what was the environment like when you were growing up? I mean, you're 8 or 9 years older than I am.
Okay.
And I know early 80s, early 90s New York, you have a slightly different perspective than I do.
So I'm laughing because with my partner, the other day when he was visiting, we watched Dog Day Afternoon because he was like, you have got to see it. Now, Dog Day Afternoon, and I do know the story, talk about an interesting take on masculinity. But one of the things he said to me is, it's very gritty. And the thing is, as we were watching it, and there were different shots of New York, of course, the Twin Towers before 9/11, and just different things that I was like, this is the New York I knew. You know, not the glam, but the gritty, the down to earth, I was born in Bed-Stuy. And some of my earliest memories were growing up in Red Hook, pre-gentrification.
Yeah, Red Hook was no joke.
Yet and still, because this was the early 70s, there still was that feel of community. I'm the oldest of 5. So I remember telling my sister that she and I were the last of the village, like the neighborhood as the village. So we had our Miss So-and-so, who was pretty much the neighborhood grandma. My father's and my mother's friends were, and they themselves were the stand-in parents when your actual parents were not there. So in a good way, I do remember things like that. And I remember the whole thing of my sister and I were the last generation of get your ass inside when the light, when that street light comes in, if not before then. So yes, I grew up with that. I know those things. Yes. And I think, like most people, there were some good things about my childhood I definitely remember. And we moved all over Brooklyn as my family group. Three more younger brothers came into the picture for us. So as that happened, we moved around Brooklyn and we lived in different neighborhoods. When I came back to New York from school, I came back to Brooklyn because, again, I love my hometown. So it's ironic that my partner lives in Brooklyn. So it's like I can't get away from it. And I think, like most people, I had good experiences, great experience, and I had some horrible experiences within the family, within the neighborhood, within circles of friends. And maybe as the conversation as appropriate, I'll delve into any of those. But I would say, as far as I'm concerned, it was a black man's growing up.
That totally makes sense. And there's so much I already identify with having neighbors who were looking out for you when your parental figures were not around,
Mm-hmm.
the feeling of community in the neighborhood. And I'm just thinking of growing up in East Flatbush, like the Stewart family and the Hall family and all the families that were on my block, and everybody was looking out for everybody else's kids.
I do have an anecdote. So, a couple of years ago, I was visiting Brooklyn. In fact, I was visiting my mother. This was just after she left Brooklyn to be with one of my brothers and his family in the Midwest.
Okay.
I went back to Red Hook. I went back to the projects. And it was very interesting because, again, my mother doesn't like New York. So she's like, be careful, or what did you go there for? And it was very interesting because, one of the block boys saw me and was just like, yo, what's up? Who are you? And so I'm not afraid. I'm like, look, I grew up here. And it was very interesting when I said some names, and it was just two names that I mentioned from my childhood, two of my childhood buddies that I grew up with, and their grandmother, who was one of the neighborhood grandmothers. They were like, oh, shit, yeah, I know those people. And the moment they said, I know those people, they relaxed around me. There's like, okay, he's not trying to start no trouble. And I said, yeah, I grew up here. And the same playground was still there. The same buildings were still there. And that's rare to say in Brooklyn. But the same things were still there. And so I got to talk to some of the people. And they were like, yeah, we remember so-and-so. We knew so-and-so. So-and-so is related to us. And I'm like, check that out. And my mother was like panicking. What were you doing there? What were you doing there? I'm like, first of all, I'm grown. And I was at the age where I was grown.
Right.
And she was even fascinated when I said, you remember two of my childhood friends, their mother, which you were close to, there were some of the block boys who knew these people. So as far as they were concerned, I was cool. And she was amazed even. So that's one of my favorite Brooklyn stories. How
I love that story.
Yeah, that's one of my favorites. And that to me is emblematic of Brooklyn, of the black community in general. So yeah.
I love that. And so growing up, early 70s, Brooklyn, when did you become aware of what you understood to be queerness?
Queerness. Now, are you talking about my own queerness or queerness my own queerness?
Your own, yeah.
I would say it wasn't in the 70s because I was just busy in some ways being a kid, enjoying being a kid, and in some ways surviving being a kid. So, yeah, queerness didn't matter to me. I had my family, I had my friends, I had school. It was, I would say, really when I was a preteen, when we left Red Hook and we grew up. It's that weird area of East New York and New Lots. If I say Linden Boulevard, you know what I'm talking about. Lincoln Avenue,
absolutely.
Linden Boulevard, where TSS used to be.
I know that area very well.
That's where pink houses. If I say pink houses, we lived in.
I definitely.
And this is what I love about growing up and meeting other people from Brooklyn. You say certain things and people just know what you're talking about. Thank you.
Exactly.
Across the street from the pink houses is where some of my brothers were born, and we spent a lot of time in that neighborhood.
Okay.
And that was where I was a preteen, starting to hit puberty, and that was where I think I became aware of my queerness. There was a neighborhood girl, her name was Phyllis, that I was absolutely and truly smitten over. But what I had also realized is that there were one or two of the neighborhood boys that I was kind of smitten over too, that I was just could not get my mind, like, and one of them, ironically, was in school, I was one of the smart kids. He was the
Okay.
other smart kid.
Smart kid.
So even though in some ways he was my rival, I didn't hate him, but I just knew what was, it's like, it's me and it's you. But because he was also so different from me in terms of race, in terms of a whole lot of things, he also fascinated me. And I realized there was probably an attraction there, at least on my end as well. So that's when I started realizing, okay, I may not be like other guys. But just also somehow knowing that I really couldn't talk about it, that there was really no one for me to go to, because in addition to the neighborhoods I was growing up in, I came from a very, at least on my mother's side, a very strict, religious, conservatively religious family. My father's family, Catholic. My mother's family, basically Protestant, AME Zionist.
Okay.
Yeah. So I like to tell people I grew up in an ecumenical, mixed religious household.
All right.
Yes. But at the same, how do I put this? Yeah. So there were all these things that, of course, in Black community, in Black families, that I heard growing up. And I also remember any hint of queerness was severely. I remember one of the worst spankings, one of the worst beatings I got. And again, I was a young kid. I was just playing with different things, ideas. There were different times I wanted to be a doctor. I wanted to be an actor. I wanted to be a dress designer. That was the thing that got me my worst beating, for some reason that I didn't understand until I eventually came out. And then when I started learning about other family members who were also LGBTQ, I was like, so this makes a lot of sense. When I realized is no one knew how to be open and how to embrace queerness. So it was something that was literally, if not verbally discouraged, actively tried to beat out of you. And it was funny how when I found out about other members of the family, even my mother's side, but especially my father's side, there was all these relatives. So why are we acting like this is such a bad thing? Particularly for the men, when there are relatives who were openly gay, openly bisexual, or at least that I also came to find out struggled with their own sexuality.
There's the open secretness of that I find troublesome in a lot of ways. But as you're telling your story, there's also so much that like resonates with me from being a kid. And it's funny how you repress things and certain things come back out. I'm thinking now, constantly being told, don't put your hands on your hips. Don't hold your wrist like this. Hold your wrist straight.
How you
Yeah.
sit, like
Don't sit.
guys.
Don't sit with your legs crossed.
Yeah, and how you crossed your legs.
Yeah.
Men could cross, and I'm getting ready to do it right now. Men could cross their legs with the leg coming over the knee.
Right.
Women were the ones who crossed their legs at the feet.
Right.
And just as we're talking, I'm realizing there was a reason for that. Ladies, in particular, crossing their legs at the feet meant access to their genitals would not be seen. Whereas if a guy puts his leg over his knee, his opposite leg over his knee, you can see what he has.
Right.
And I was this second years old when I realized even the crossing of the legs had sexual connotation and was very coded. Gender roles was just so regulated. And in some cases, violently so.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I've probably told this story before on this podcast, or maybe not even on this podcast, but I've always been really into music. I've always had a thing for music. And there was a time when that was actively discouraged because I think that my elder relatives thought that being as into music as I was, and this was a time of Michael Jackson and Prince and people who were very like femme coded, I think, to a certain extent. It was the 80s. Thought that my dedication to music was sort of an indicator of my not being quote unquote masculine enough.
And you know what the irony is about. So there's a joke and there's a meme. Prince.
Mm-hmm.
Prince. The only guy who could wear lace, wear ruffles, walk with his ass out, wear heels, and still take your girl.
Yeah, I've seen another version of that where it's like Prince will steal your girl and then wear her clothes.
So the whole thing is, as femme-coded as they may have been, no one, particularly Prince, really questioned their sexuality.
Right.
And so the whole thing is, it's just very interesting how certain professions that on the surface people would enjoy, musicians, drag artists. Come on,
Mm-hmm.
these are our parents and grandparents, from Milton Berle to Flip Wilson.
Flip Wilson is Geraldine.
Right.
Yep.
And no one had any problem with Flip Wilson going, "What you see is what you get." And yet, at the same time, if their own kids had any inkling of effeminacy or drag, or in your case, leaning toward music, I
Mm-hmm.
remember my mother also sharing with me that at one point she wanted to be an actress, but was discouraged because there were so many lesbians in the field.
God.
Which is ironic because she's a retired nurse, and I can't even tell her how many lesbians and bisexual women are in the field. So
There
I'm
are
just
queer
like, so
people
what was
in
the point?
every field.
What was the point? So,
Right.
but it's just very interesting how when it's fine for other people and we don't question their sexuality in certain professions unless it's our own. And then it's like, oh, well, there are gay folks there, or that means you. And I'm like, what is the cognitive dissonance? What is that about?
Yep. So, at what point did you actually come out? And in what environment did that take place? Like, how did you sort of discover your sexuality and lean into it?
Well, those to me are two different questions because I discovered my sexuality when I was still in New York as a teenager. And the first word that comes to my mind was dangerous. First of all, I think about, again, coming out in New York or starting to come into my own as a teenager. And again, a very conservative household where I didn't know anybody who was gay or bisexual. And I didn't have those resources, that support. And this was also around the time that HIV was emerging. So that was also a reason for me to really not say anything. And I love my mother dearly. And looking back, I also just realized as I was starting to come into my own sexually, or at least start to discover, she did her best, as most single mothers do.
Mm-hmm.
I think even my father, with even some of his struggles, he tried his best. But then after they separated, after they split, of course, the kids were with our mother. And I think at that time, she just could pass on everything she had heard, which ironically, a lot of fathers do to their sons also. But no one prepped me for what it could possibly mean to be gay or bisexual. So it was just something that I learned. And even as folks began to suspect, I remember my mother saying, don't bring that gay stuff up in here. You've got younger brothers. And if you are, I'm going to have to disown you. Oh, I remember getting that talk at 16. So even before I understood, people could sense things. I got picked on at the high school that I went to, partly because I was a handful of guys who were black in a majority white school. But then again, I guess because I didn't fit whatever stereotype I was expected to fit, I was somehow gay coded before I could even understand what that meant. So I remember getting picked on, getting teased, even getting beat. I've only started talking about this in the past year, but I was a teenager when I was molested by an older man in public on a subway train. And again, that was something that I only started processing in the past year and a half, that I've just really started talking about. My family does not know. Again, I didn't know how to process it, and I didn't trust anyone in my family would help me be able to process it.
Sure.
So I think there were a lot of things that people sensed about me as a teenager that people didn't know how to nurture, that it was either trying to suppress or exploit. And I laugh at this memory about being in the village. And I was 15 years old, this I remember, and just walking around. I was what they would call a good kid. And I think I may have went to a track meet, and then on my way home, because I ran track in high school, and I stopped in the village just to get something to eat. And there was this older man, not attractive in my eyes, but he just seemed to very nervously was like talking to me. And then at 15, I didn't understand. First of all, I was like, I don't know you. You don't look like somebody I would talk to. But looking at him now through older gay men's eyes, I was like, you liked what you saw. And maybe it was predatory. Maybe he didn't understand how young I was. But what I do remember, and ironically about the guy who molested me, was that sense of loneliness, that sense of tentativeness, that sense of... And this other guy that I'm talking about, while I was eating pizza, and he just seemed he was more nervous than I was. So we exchanged a few words. And again, for someone who's ages 14 through 17, none of this makes sense.
Right.
Growing up in a religious household, I tried to pray the gay away, my own self. That was very much a reality for me. No one thought about conversion therapy, and maybe because they didn't either know. No, they did know about it.
Did they?
But I guess no one could afford it. But yeah, I tried to pray the gay away thing to the point where when I would pray, I would break out into a cold sweat. So again, growing up as a teenager in Brooklyn, in New York City, it was not a pleasant experience. It was not until, and I call it the soybean fields of Ohio, where I went to Oberlin College.
Oh, wow.
Oberlin College was where I finally began to get my liberation, my freedom. First of all, I picked Oberlin because on the quiet tip, it not only had a wonderful English program, which I was interested at that time. That's not my degree. That's not my field of study. It's Black Studies and Sociology. But also because I knew about its activism and I knew about its gay-friendly campus. And I said, I think that's where I need to go. No one in my family could understand why I was going to Oberlin, a school no one had heard of, a school where I was not offered a scholarship. Other schools I had applied to, I had been offered scholarships to, and I turned them down because I wanted to come out, and I wanted to come out safely. Of course, I couldn't say that then. And again, why was I going so far away from home? That was exactly the reason why, to try to figure myself out. And so as soon as my dad dropped me off on campus, I went to find, at the time, the LGB Union, the Lesbian Gay Union, as it was known at that point. And it's funny because the same time that I went to the LG Union, the Lesbian Gay Union, right next to it was the Sexual Information Center. That was equally important because I went in there to see what they had in terms of books, in terms of condoms, because I also knew I was finally going to lose my virginity, some way, shape, form, or fashion. That's when I started learning about HIV. And I was like, you know what? This is interesting. I would like to get involved with that to see what I can do to help prevent it. So my going to Oberlin was very important for not only my coming out, but it was the beginning of my activism, but also learning about HIV, which would eventually become my profession, my career, my vocation in terms of calling. So it was September of 1985. And that's why I tell people this year will make it 40 years that I've been involved in HIV prevention.
And it's good to have that framing because, for people who are younger or people who are straight who might be listening to this, don't necessarily have a finger on where we were at in terms of not only queer acceptance, but in terms of the HIV and AIDS story in 1985. And
Right.
I mean, look, I was 9 years old, so I don't have a ton of frame of reference either.
Right.
I mean, I started to come out a decade after that, and it still wasn't incredibly safe, even in New York City. So I can't imagine it was safe at all in most of the rest of this country. Um,
So I have a question for you.
sure.
When you started coming out in New York City, was this in the 19, either the latter part of the 80s or the beginning, anytime during the 80s or to the mid 90s? When did you
It
start
was
coming out?
it was the mid to late 90s. I feel like the first time I ever came out to somebody, it was like 1994, 1995.
Okay. So during the Clinton years, am I correct?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
So while the Clinton years were joyous compared to the Reagan era, the Bush years, and now currently the Trump years, particularly the second administration, I think the Clinton administration was a mixed bag. And I say mixed bag because even though it wasn't as oppressive as, say, some of the administration of some of his colleagues, that was also the era that gave us Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
right.
And I think Don't Ask, Don't Tell, whatever the motivations were, had the impact of, again, enforcing, particularly for the military, but I think in society at large, even in the major cities, the sense of not fully being able to be out, not really being safe to be out. Don't ask, don't tell wasn't just a military policy, it became a way of life. Even to some degree, when I talk about being in a non monogamous relationship, which I have been in for most of my adult life, and not this one, but I mean in general, that's who I am.
Sure.
The way I describe it is do ask, do tell, where I prefer to talk about it, to ask, to be able to have the conversations with my partner about what we're doing. And it's funny how we call it either do ask, do tell, or don't ask, don't tell.
Right.
So
Right.
that gives you an idea of just how much of an impact that policy during the time you were probably most likely coming out during the Clinton years, the impact, and I would say even negative impact it had on how we talked about sex and sexuality.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I come from the days when, you know, sex education taught in school was still fairly abstinence based.
Mm-hmm.
There was the condom over the banana to
Yeah.
show you how that worked. There was this movie called The Miracle of Life or something like that where they showed a childbirth. And that was as risque as anything sexuality based was. And this is the New York City public school system in the early 90s. So, not incredibly long ago. You know, it was still very much HIV and AIDS panic, hysteria. It was right after Magic Johnson
Right.
went public with his diagnosis. And particularly for, I'm listening to your story and I'm checking off boxes in my own life because I think your story and my story are parallel in a lot of ways. And in my religious, conservative family, Black, immigrant, Caribbean background, like being a queer man was not, it was just not going to happen. There was no precedent. I didn't meet another openly gay or bisexual man until I was already starting to come out. Just to give maybe young people a sense of perspective, where we are now, where all you got to do is go online and you're inundated with queer people, which is fantastic. Not the case when you and I were going through this
Exactly.
process. All right.
Exactly. And it's interesting as you were talking, I thought about the fact, okay, I was 18 years old when I had the experience of going to Oberlin and starting to come out and starting HIV education. It was 19 years old when I finally started telling folks, like in my family and among my friends, because being so excited about coming out and being open and being active, I came back to New York. And one of the first things I did was march in the Gay Pride Parade. And I also remember at 18, turning 19,
Mm.
ducking cameras, wanting to be open, wanting to be free, but at the same time, knowing that I had not told people yet. And that was not the way to enjoy New York City gay pride, because there were plenty of cameras. So you can imagine this young kid literally ducking and weaving and whoop, and whoop camera.
Yeah.
And I realized that's not how I wanted to live. And ironically, when I started coming out at age 19, yes, I got a lot of the pushback. I got a lot of the non-understanding, all of this and all of that. But what I also got when I finally told my dad was this nonchalance. which I was surprised about. And that's when I learned about other relatives, particularly on my father's side, who were part of the LGBTQ community. And you want to talk about mind blown, because so then why was it such a big deal when I wanted to be a dress designer? Why was it a big deal when I didn't come out yet, but I wrote an op-ed in which New York newspaper was it? It was Daily News, because then I hated the Post. So it was the New York Daily News, where I challenged someone and their AIDS phobia and their AIDS bigotry. And it was very interesting. My grandmother, my father's mother, and usually I was her darling, I was her baby, but she ratted me out to my dad. At that time, I was just talking smack about wanting to be a dress designer. But it was very interesting to me. She cut out and she saved the response that I gave. And so I think it was either him or my mother who said she gave it to my dad and said, well, he's your son. And it dawned on me, well, wait a minute. She didn't have to keep that. She could have just showed the paper and thrown it out. She cut out the column and she gave it to him, which means that she held on to it. So I was just like, what did this mean? And I never had a chance to ask her, what did it mean for her to see me being this level of activist? I have so many questions for my grandmother when I get to the other side. It's like, girl. And not in a bad way, because again, I was one of her favorites. My dad even told me so. And sure enough, every time I would visit her, there would be in the kitchen, in the corner of one of the cabinets, a blue tin of the Danish butter cookies.
Oh, Lord.
No one else opened it. Maybe she did, but she was the only other person. No one bothered it. It was clear who it was for.
It was for you.
And no matter what time of year, especially Christmas, but if it was outside of Christmas, it was for me, and I dove right on it. So it's weird having that dichotomy of being spoiled, being the favored, and yet in some ways being the troublemaker, the black sheep, the odd one.
Right. So, I feel that completely. So one thing that you mentioned earlier was in reference to the tentativeness of the men that you met when you were super young. And I think about that again in terms of my own experience, where I remember the first couple of experiences that I had. If I was going to bars or something like that, it was always older men, significantly older men, who were this really interesting combination of aggressive and timid. And this was a time when, when in the confines of a space that was a safe space, they were very aggressive and forward. Like, it took me a while before I was like, oh, like grabbing somebody's dick isn't like a hello greeting inside a gay space. Now that I know about consent and all that stuff, it's a much different story now. But when I was coming out, particularly because I was young meat, like I'm 19, 20 years old in these bars, and old guys, their hands would be shaking, and they'd be very almost like timid about it, but they would reach for your junk. And as I'm thinking about it, I'm giving them grace because they came from a time when they were not allowed to openly express interest in a safe way.
And it's interesting because I'm glad you said the word consent, because one of the challenges I have with how we talk about consent is that it is framed in one way that does not take into account the diversity of the different communities. Because as particularly older gay men of a certain generation, then you just touched on it, the ways that our spaces, the thing that I'm critical of is that the conversations around enthusiastic consent, which I do appreciate and I do engage in and I do like it. First of all, not everyone is able to verbally vocalize. If you have someone who is hearing impaired, they may not be able to verbally vocalize. They may not be able to or know how to gesticulate and say yes, or may be challenged depending on the environment that they're in to do so. So there are some issues around access and being differently abled, that enthusiastic consent that people did not think about. Similarly, and I understand that enthusiastic consent really came out of a culture that recognized that sexism, misogyny, and rape culture are real things that women, trans and cis, need to protect themselves against. So that's why I support enthusiastic consent. And what I want to tell people is there is a generation of men, my generation and older, who remember consent was framed differently. That when you went to a bar, particularly a bar with a back room, when you went to bathhouses, when you went to sex clubs, and now sex parties, that once upon a time, you were, how do I put this? Consent was assumed the moment you walked through the door because there weren't many places and spaces like this where men who were attracted to other men could meet. So when you learned about these places and what they were, consent was assumed because you knew what the nature of the place was. So enthusiastic consent did not need to be given. However, consent did still have to be respected. If someone touched you or groped you, that was not a violation of consent immediately. But if you let it be known, hey, I'm not interested, or not right now, no thanks, and people persisted, make no mistake, you were dealt with. You were dealt with by usually by that person, that guy right there, as well as by management of the place. It's like, nah, get the fuck out of here. So the whole thing is, and I have said this when I've been asked to speak about consent, that we have to understand that there's more than one way to express consent. There is no one way. And especially if we want to be a welcoming space to everyone, we have to understand that many of us have either different or more than one ways of how we've learned to express consent. And I think particularly in the leather and kink communities, that's not taken into account, that a person, particularly if he's an older man, he is presumed to be a violator. Now, do violations happen? And are serial violators an issue? Yes, regardless of how you were taught consent. But I think that some of us experience where people are just presumed automatically to be violators of consent.
Well, it's like the saying goes, when you know better, you do better.
Right.
But we have to give people the chance to know better so that they can do better.
And to understand that there still is more than one way to give consent. And I would say particularly among the men's community, when it comes to men who are with men, there are generational divides because I see some of the younger men taking on the enthusiastic consent, and that's to be respected. I think there's also a difference between when it comes to cisgender versus transgender men. Transgender men may be more about the enthusiastic consent, and that has to be respected. And if you have an older man who initially does what we've always done and immediately, tentatively, or assertively grabs the dick or grabs the ass, because we've been in spaces where that initial grab was not a violation of consent. It was after you said no. And if that continued, then you was either going to get your lights punched out and or put out and banned. And I think we don't have enough of these conversations. And I think that's where people either get frustrated by or fascinated by me when I talk about consent. Because I'm like, no, there is not just one way. A way that I would add that while it protects and challenges us around access to women's bodies and promoting that, thwarts and tries to fight rape culture and undo access to women's bodies and how we see women, that I think it was also, I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but I'm going to say it anyway, rooted in terms of homophobia because it did not allow for discussions in terms of how gay men, particularly older gay men, how we formed spaces and how we constructed consent. And without the willingness to hear there are more than one ways.
Right.
And I already talked about how ableist the enthusiastic consent construct is. And that was something that was pointed out to me. And I was like, oh, so we have to realize there's more than one way of consent. And we have to keep that in mind.
And we need to have these discussions and be aware of things like context and nuance and history. And, I'm a little embarrassed by the fact that I'm damn near 200 episodes into this podcast, and this is the first conversation I'm having about consent with another queer man.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
As they said it in the series Insecure, you know what that is? Growth.
It is growth, absolutely. And, I've had this conversation with a lot of straight men, because in a lot of polyamorous, non monogamous culture, the discussion about consent is usually women led. But I do think that it needs to be spoken about, obviously, within men who have sex with men as well.
Yes.
And there's a different history to take into account there. I do want to talk a little bit about, and I'm going to try to say this as sensitively as possible.
Or just say it as you need to.
Right. I don't see this as often anymore, but that may just be because I'm not as in the scene as I was at one point. But the masc versus femme dichotomy in queer male culture and what that looks like and how that works and how people identify. So sexuality and gender to me are two very different things.
Yes, I agree.
I know that some people experience those in tandem. I am not one of those people. I have never felt like I was not a man. And I have an appreciation for people who are not as binary feeling. That just is not my experience. I have always considered myself a fairly masculine human being. Now, that doesn't mean I fucking, it doesn't mean I grab my nuts and spit and wear a cowboy hat and work extra hard to put bass in my voice or anything like that. But I consider myself what some people would call soft masc. And I often feel like there's an element of gay male culture, bi male culture, queer male culture, that there's an element of it that prioritizes masculinity. And there is another element of it that completely frowns on masculinity. And it's a little confusing. And at the end of the day, Rodney, it's really like, I'm just trying to be me, like whoever I am. And what people externally see that as is their problem. But, it just feels like there's these roles that you have to almost performatively lock yourself into. And the older I get, the less sense it makes to me.
So as you were talking, I'm like, the more this brother talks, the more we're going to have to unpack.
Okay.
Because let's start at the very beginning when you talked about, and I'm going to table for now, masculine versus feminine.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to table that because you followed that up with grabbing nuts, spitting, and wearing cowboy hats. And there was a part of me that's like, God, that sounds like a wonderful sex encounter. Where do I sign up for that? Of course, I'm going to spit. Of course, yeah, I'll spit on you if you want. Shit. I'll grab your nuts. I do a little CBT. I like cowboy hats. They turn me on. I'm like, where do they do that at?
Oh,
where do
God.
they do that at? And how do
You should
I
know
sign
where they
up
do that
for
at.
that?
You should know where they do that at.
But there are a lot of kinksters who are not in the community.
Right.
So and that's a whole nother conversation.
That's a whole other conversation.
That's the follow-up podcast.
We're gonna say that for part 2.
Okay. So getting back to the masculine versus feminine first, and it's very interesting how you framed it within the diversity of gender expression, because that's just not the only place where that is. Even among those of us who identify as cisgender men, it's a masculine versus feminine, which has always thrown me because, first of all, and I think especially as a black man, and let's keep it real, for some guys, if you don't have that street, if you don't have that thug, then you ain't masculine.
Right.
And I don't even call myself soft masculine. Once upon a time, I flirted with that. But when someone called me a soft top and didn't want me to fuck them, I was like, well, that was your loss. Well, I came to see it was his loss. But at the time, I was like, but I'm still going to, as my dad, and that's a whole nother conversation, taught me to tear that ass up. But all of this to say, just because I don't give thug, I don't give street, don't mean that I won't rock your world. Doesn't mean that I don't like football. As I said at the top of the hour, I still participate in some things that are considered masculine that I find joy in, that I love, that resonates with who I am as a man, as a human, as a person. So even amongst cisgender men, what we consider masculine versus what we consider feminine, there are, of course, some men who fit it squarely in each of those camps, but most of us fall, if you look at how it's traditionally defined, kind of fall somewhere in between. So I
There's
think
a wide spectrum.
Thank you. There is a spectrum of how masculinity is presented, and I think that is the value for those of us who are cisgender, the value of having people who do not fit in that binary spectrum to have us look at and question, is it live or is it Memorex? Is what we're being told what is masculine, what is feminine, what is male, what is female. And the thing is, particularly as people of color, as black and brown skinned folk, we have culturally histories that have understood that gender is not binary per se. So for me, there's a freedom in saying, yes, I'm not soft masculine. I'm masculine, you know. So no, I don't buy the soft masculine. Well, no, I'll say for me as a man, because I respect the butch femme as part of lesbian culture. I respect it. I'm here for it. I really am. Even in our own culture, when you talk about the ball scene, and there's the butch queen.
Right.
Along with the femme queen. And these are people who may identify as still cisgender men, or they may identify as non-binary, or they may be trans. And I'm talking about on the femme queen side, maybe even on the butch queen side. But still, the whole thing is that there is a diversity. And I think that's what we can learn. That's what we can glean from. So it's like, yeah, I'm masculine. That's how I see myself. That's how I carry myself. Although between me and you, again, that whole spectrum, because, I can get down with the girl. I can go, what's up? And that's how many of us, particularly those of us who are gay or bisexual, that's how we are. That's who we are. And even some of the straight men who are free with who they are can go there too. I've gone there with some straight guys.
Rodney, it's absolutely astounding to me how, like, in the last 15 to 20 years, so much gay slang, gay black slang, has popped into everyday straight cisgender white conversation. It is absolutely amazing to me.
Now, Mike, Big Mike. Let's talk about that. Let's unpack that, because I was fine with this conversation where I thought we were going. In terms of when you said straight cisgender, I'm thinking, okay, he's going to talk about in the black community. That to me is fine because that's what we're part of. But the moment you said white, I was just like, oh, I'm having a raisin in the potato salad moment now. Because appropriation, and I think I'm very sensitive to it now, with the reign of white supremacy that is being ushered in, especially with the Trump administration, but even before then, I would say in reaction to the Obama administration, we saw this rise in racism, in racial hatred, in white supremacy. Let's call it really for what it is. So when I see white folks appropriating any part of black culture, my initial thing is, okay, appropriation, feeling that as a white person, of course, you can consume other people's culture, even as you deep down hate those very same people.
Right.
Yes. You want to talk about being on fleek. First of all, do you really understand what that means?
Right. Right.
It's one thing for Beyonce to do Renaissance, because she has that connection through her Uncle Johnny, and she's part of the culture. And Taylor Swift doing Renaissance would have been like,
Right. Well, there's, Beyonce
And,
has been around queer black culture her whole life.
and most black folks have been around black queer culture their whole lives. So
Absolutely true.
it makes sense. Flip Wilson, regardless of what his sexual orientation may or may not have been, we've been around that caricature, that portrayal of black womanhood. It's probably been around black gay men who imitated that. Who either
Right.
imitated that or who that was who they were. So again, black folks having that proximity to black queer culture makes sense. And the flip side also, because I can hear someone say, well, Beyonce did country. What she did was reclaimed country of the white supremacy that has its clutches around it to expose the black culture that formed it, that gave it its root. There's a difference. She did not appropriate something white. She reclaimed something that was ours, that was stolen. That's why people are mad at Beyonce. So I think as it relates to masculinity, I think there are some things bringing it back to who we are. And I'm going to say, as a black man, that I think as a black man and as a black queer man, there is sexuality, there's masculinity, there are really sexualities, there's masculinities that has always been present, if not outright accepted, at least present within who we were as culture. So it is very, how should I say, challenging when people resist the different expressions of who we are, particularly as black men, and how, even if we identify as masculine, how the different expressions of masculinity are different, and by the same token, how there are different expressions of femininity, and not just among women, but among men. There are those of us who say, I may be masculine, but I'm not afraid to show certain sides of me. And so respect, even though I don't accept or I don't embrace the idea of me being like a soft top or soft masculine, I have to remember there's a spectrum that is not the binary, that there is a spectrum. Then when I talk to a brother who says, I'm Mike and I identify as soft masculine, that I go, hey, what's up?
Right. And I think that there is a lot of value in understanding all sides, right? Like, as long as, your head is in the right place, like, blackness is not a monolith, masculinity is not a monolith, queerness is not a monolith. There's so much shading based on experience and context and location and upbringing and all that stuff that makes us who we are. And it's really about welcoming in all of the differences between us, as opposed to saying what is one thing and what is not one thing, and so on and so forth. You know what I'm saying?
And yes, and it was
Yeah.
interesting how when we understand that for ourselves, we can understand that better for other people. I was
Right.
hanging out with one of my good friends last week, and we were talking about something similar because one of the things I'm clear about, and they kind of reinforced that for me, when I'm comfortable with who I am, I'm not worried about what you're doing. Straight men, heterosexual men of any race who are really comfortable in who they are could care less.
Don't give a shit.
Right. It is same thing with, I think, those of us who are bothered by gender. Okay, so we were talking about sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
Damon and I were talking about gender expression. In both cases, because I'm secure in who I am as a cisgender man, I could care less how you identify. In fact, I'm probably more likely to be your ally. Because let's be honest, as a cisgender man, especially these days, we inhabit a space of privilege.
Yes, we do.
Yes, we do. And I think it becomes important that as I am comfortable and I enjoy who I get to be as a cisgender man, I don't have the luxury of being able to say, oh, too bad for you, because you're transgender, you're non-binary, you're gender non-conforming. I don't have that luxury to say, too bad for you. I have to step in and say, and I think it ties into your question to me about my journey coming into myself as a gay/queer man. And that's the other part of it too. If I have enjoyed the company, sexual and otherwise, non-conforming transgender individuals, non-binary folks, transgender folks, then why am I going to turn around and say, oh, but you know what? Too bad for you. When I think about the struggle of what I had to go through, and sometimes to maintain my sense of peace and comfort in myself as someone who is cisgender, who is not heterosexual, then I want to create that space. I want to create that freedom for anybody to be who they are.
Mm-hmm.
Period. It's like, I mean, and it sounds like a weird way to say it, but why do I get to have all the fun? Why do I get
You're
to
absolutely
have
right.
all of the goodies? Why can't someone else enjoy that sense of peace and safety, even if it's relative? Because again, as a black gay man who's with a white gay man, you know, especially if we are engaging in PDA, you know, there are parts of the city I don't feel comfortable doing it. And there are parts of the city, whether we're talking New York or DC, where I do feel comfortable.
Okay.
But I still have a space where I'm comfortable enough to do it.
Is that because of it being two men, or is it because of you
Both.
being an interracial couple?
Both. In fact, there are some spaces where I might be comfortable being with another man, but then I'm also aware we're a white man and a black man. And I think especially in this period that we're in, for me, it's a heightened awareness. Like, only white folks say my spidey senses are tingling, because as brown skinned people, we always have that. I saw that on social media and I was like, it tracks. That is so true. Right. Right. It wasn't
Black
my spidey
folks gotta
senses are
have
tingling. I woke up like this.
Black folks gotta have their head on swivel all the time.
Right. I woke up with my spidey senses tingling.
Mm-hmm.
Or I was fine until I walked out the door.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. So the whole thing is whether I am granted that space of security and peace, or whether I carve that space out for myself, even in the midst of discomfort, then I need to be about that for anyone else, regardless of their. And I think this is at the heart of challenging toxic masculinity. And that is looking at, one, how we construct masculinity, that it not only hurts us as men, and I'm going to say men in general, because I think there are some transgender men who by default go into the same tropes of masculinity as those of us who are cisgender do.
Absolutely.
So,
and I've had conversations with some trans men on this show where they talk about that.
yeah, and I've seen it. And part of me is just like, yeah, that's how I know you're a man. Because we're dealing with the same shit.
Same bullshit. Yep.
Right. And so not only in terms of looking at how it keeps us from really embracing and being comfortable in our own skin, but how does masculinity keep and that desire or that drive, because sometimes it's not a desire, it's a fear of, if I don't fit this, or I aspire to it because if I don't fit this, then I don't have access, or so I think. So then how do we look at masculinity in ways that won't keep us from feeling uncomfortable around, but embracing anyone else, regardless of their sexual identity, regardless of their gender expression and gender identity, regardless of their race?
Right.
And I think that that third one may be tougher now, white supremacy being what it is now. And yet, for those of us who are connected, for whatever reason, like myself, it's like, then we've got to navigate that.
Right. Right. Absolutely. I do want you to talk a little bit about your podcast.
Yes. So I currently have one podcast. It's called Listen to Daddy, that I have with my friend Daddy Rob. And it really is a podcast by, for, and about issues related to older gay men. And we realized that as we are older, as we have crossed our 50s, and in my case, barreling towards 60, that there are things, particularly as gay/queer men, that we don't talk about, that we don't usually create the spaces for us to talk about, to explore. And that's why we set up the podcast. It's interesting. My father passed away in January.
I'm sorry.
It happens. That's part of life. And it was interesting because we had wanted to talk about an end of life podcast that really was just looking at how do you put your final affairs in order. The timing of it couldn't have been better in the sense that with my father's passing and my going through the grieving process, as well as with my mother and my siblings going through handling his best friend, I might add, handling final affairs, it not only became okay, end of life in terms of doing the process of setting up your affairs, but it was also around what is the stigma around talking about dying, talking about death, talking about final affairs. That was a back and forth, a conversation that was sometimes easy and sometimes not easy with both of my parents, particularly my dad. That was an issue. How do we feel good about death? How do we feel good about saying goodbye to someone? You know,
Mm.
what is that mourning process like when you lose a significant other, a parent, a spouse, a partner, you know? So it was interesting to have that conversation. We also just wrapped up and we had started the conversation in February, but we finished it this month on older gay men and finding love and finding relationships. That was for Valentine's Day. And we're both in long term. Daddy Rob's relationship is much longer than mine and Damon's, but we talked about what does it mean to be older, wanting that or not wanting that.
Yeah.
And what does it mean if, for those of us who do want it, what does it mean to do so when we're older? Because to be honest with you, when we talk about finding love, that's usually the younger person's game.
Right.
The expectation is when you're older, you'll either be in a long term relationship or you'll be widowed and or divorced, and you won't want to do that again. And we're just like, oh, hell no, that's not the truth. We will be taping with Damon, given his background, actually his and my background, we're talking about STDs. And that's for April, which features STD Awareness Week. So we want to talk about sexual health for older gay men. What are the trends that we're seeing? Talking about PrEP and DoxyPep. So this is just to give you a snapshot of what we talk about, what we cover, and Listen to Daddy. And what I can do is I can send you the link that hopefully when you edit that, the link for the episodes of Listen to Daddy, which is featured on YouTube, people will be able to see.
Yes, please. I will be happy to do that.
So that, and I will also be launching Sexy Soul Sunday. So Sexy Soul Sunday is what I call the jewels in the road that we find when love, sex, health, and relationships intersect.
Mm.
So I really want to talk about my understanding and things that I want to share with people around those issues, those topics. So again, with my 4 decades in sexual health, particularly as it relates to HIV and STIs, my own experiences, my lived experiences in relationships, the short term, the longer term, and the one I'm currently in. Gleaning from from my training, and a lot of people don't know this, my own training as a deacon who was on the ministerial path.
Oh, wow.
So that I did not eventually get ordained, and that's a whole nother story. But again, as someone who was clergy, as someone who did the religious training, so I gleaned from all of that, from everything that I have learned, and I think I'm finally ready to do this podcast. You know, it's one thing when you have a significant other who's like, you can do this, you can do this. It's about time you do this. You need to do this. If they can do this, you can do this. It's a whole other thing when you yourself are like, okay, finally this has to happen.
I'm ready. Yeah.
I'm ready.
You gotta be ready.
So I would say I was leaning toward March, but I think with my father's passing and with other things that have happened, it looks like April will be the launch. And I'm and the more I think about it, the more excited I am. So yes. So Lord willing, the next time we do this, I'll be able to talk to you more about Sexy Soul Sunday.
I love that. I'm excited for you.
I got to give a shout out to Daddy Rod for taking time out of his schedule and sitting down and talking once again. I hope this is the first of multiple conversations recorded for the podcast, not recorded for the podcast, whatever. Apologies a little bit to you listeners for some of the Brooklyn related inside baseball, but I also think that it's part of the conversation, right? This inside baseball stuff is kind of what makes it fun sometimes. And I also want to give a shout out because we did talk about families and being raised by communities during our upbringing, and I wanted to give a shout out to the families that helped my grandparents out when I was being raised, particularly the Halls and the Stewarts, Mrs. Jones, the Taft family, everybody who was kind of like my village when I was growing up and helped make me the person that I am. If you would like to know more about Rodney McCoy, you can check his podcast out on YouTube. It is called Listen to Daddy. And you can also follow him on Instagram. His IG handle is daddy.rod.now. Once again, that is daddy.rod.now. Once again, I look forward to having more of you on this podcast, and I want to thank everybody for taking the time to listen.
Thank you for listening to Detoxicity. I hope you found this particular episode interesting. And if you are new, I hope you go back and listen to all of the older episodes. Once again, my name is Mike Joseph. I am the host and producer of this show. And there are a lot of things that you can do to continue to support our mission, continue to support this podcast. Follow me on social media. I am on Instagram, Twitter, and I'm on TikTok as DetoxPod Guy. You can also send me an email if you'd like. I'm at detoxpod@gmail.com. I am always on the hunt for people with interesting, inspirational, and powerful stories. So if you know somebody who fits that bill, or if you yourself fit that bill, please don't hesitate to drop me a line via email or via social media. Please make sure you subscribe on your podcast platform that you're listening to this on. Rate, comment, help a brother out, help us move up in the rankings. Follow me on social media. Like I said, follow our Patreon, or subscribe to my Patreon, actually. Patreon.com/detoxicitypod. You get access to exclusive episodes. You get episodes a little earlier than the general public. You get a cool ass sticker, lots of stuff. Once again, patreon.com/detoxicitypod. Quick shout out to Calvin Williams for providing the music and doing his magic on the logo, which was originally designed by Jacob Block. I thank you all for listening. I wish you all the best. Please take care of each other. Till next time, peace.